February 26, 1991, 22:30 hours. The empty wasteland of Wadi al-Batin, Kuwait. The night is absolute, a blank, starless void that swallows the dunes, the soldiers, and the steel giants buried beneath them. For the officers of the Iraqi Republican Guard's Tawakalma division, this darkness is safety. Their tanks are entrenched behind sand berms, wrapped in armor they trust, the T-72M. To them, this machine is more than a vehicle. It is heritage. It is the direct descendant of the armored spearheads that shattered Hitler's panzers at Kursk. It is the purest expression of Soviet design, lethal, mass-produced, ruthlessly practical. Its 125mm smoothbore cannon is a close-range killer revered from Eastern Europe's plains to Afghanistan's jagged passes. Tonight, its crews wait confidently, staring through the eerie green haze of their active IR systems. They believe they are the predators. Then the night breathes. At first, it isn't a noise. It's a shift in pressure, a faint vibration, a strange, high, unnatural whine drifting across the sand. It sounds like a jet engine, but it's coming from the ground. Inside their dugouts, Iraqi commanders listen to confused radio chatter, static, crosstalk, then a report. Enemy armor sighted. But the distance is impossible. More than 3,000 meters. The T-72's gun is accurate to maybe 2,000 meters in perfect conditions. At 3 kilometers, its sights are useless. A sergeant in a forward T-72 flips on his massive L4 IR searchlight, a huge spotlight invisible to the naked eye. Through his TPN-149 sight, the desert turns into a shimmering green world. He scans left, right, forward. Nothing. Only sand. The first hit is soundless. A thin, blinding white streak, narrower than a pencil, travels 3 kilometers in under 2 seconds. No arc, no drop. A perfect, surgical line. The sergeant never sees it. He's facing the wrong direction. The tank beside him, barely 30 meters away, simply ceases to exist. There is no fireball, only physics. A depleted uranium dart, a rod of super-dense metal traveling faster than a mile per second, smashes into the T-72's glacis plate. Sloped armor, laminates, it ignores them. It slices through the hull like paper. Friction turns the penetrator into a white-hot jet of metal as it enters the crew compartment. A split second later, massive overpressure blasts the 18-ton turret skyward like a spinning disc. The ammunition carousel detonates in a jack-in-the-box burst that wipes out the crew instantly. The sergeant yanks his turret around, panic choking him. "Contact! Contact! Where is it?" His radio explodes with terror. Another tank goes up, then another. White lances are stabbing through the night from invisible killers. The Iraqi tanks fire back into the storm blindly, 125mm shells thundering into emptiness. Their rounds land harmlessly in the sand, hundreds of meters short. A commander screams into the net, "Use the AT-11s! Launch the missiles!" The T-72M's trump card is the 9M119 Swear, a laser-guided missile fired straight from the main gun. A gunner catches a heat flicker, a vague shape in the dark. He fires. The missile shrieks into the air. He steadies the crosshairs, guiding it with a laser beam. For a moment, he believes he has a hit. Then his guidance beam scatters, disrupted by an unseen wall of obscurance and countermeasures. His optics flicker. The missile veers off course. Seconds later, a projectile slams into his tank. Not a kinetic round, a shaped charge round. It burns through his tracks and disables the vehicle. The crew survives, but they are immobilized. Helpless, they peer through their vision blocks as their entire battalion is destroyed with machine-like precision. This is not a battle. It is an execution. Hundreds of miles to the north, in a sealed briefing room in Moscow, there is no shouting, only a cold, growing dread. The men watching the grainy footage are not Iraqis. They are Soviet generals, marshals, GRU analysts, the architects of Soviet armored doctrine. The source is CNN. They watch blurry thermal images broadcast live, tiny glowing white rectangles, their tanks, being picked off one after another by small black specks. They see columns of T-72s and T-55s, a sea of Soviet armor caught on open roads like targets on a firing range. This was never supposed to happen. The T-72 was the backbone of the Warsaw Pact, the killing spear meant to tear through the Fulda Gap. The entire Soviet vision of a European war depended on that machine and on overwhelming armored mass. What they are watching is not combat. It is technological slaughter. A GRU colonel, his face drained, whispers to his superior, "What is destroying them?" The general keeps his eyes on the screen. "We don't know." The colonel tries to reason with himself. The Iraqis have the export version, the T-72M. It's inferior. Our T-72B, the T-80, they have Contact 5. They're better. It is the last fragile attempt to deny what they are seeing.
"Are they really superior?" the general finally replies, his voice so soft it barely carries. "The field reports, the armor penetrations are happening at distances we cannot even observe. They occur in total darkness, where our best night optics are useless. The Iraqis are firing back, and their own crews claim the rounds are bouncing off." He taps a folder on the table. "The preliminary after-action accounts from our advisors in Baghdad make no sense. They talk about ghosts, about silent death cutting through the desert, about tanks moving faster than 70 kilometers an hour across open ground, hitting targets with perfect accuracy while on the move." The room falls into a suffocating silence. Shooting accurately while moving, at night, at 3 kilometers and beyond, this is not an advantage in numbers. It is an entirely new category of warfare, a phantom the Soviets had never prepared for. A young analyst at the back, barely out of engineering school, clears his throat. All eyes turn to him. "Comrade General, what if the issue isn't the tank? What if the Americans are not using tanks in the way we understand? What if we're not fighting vehicles, but a system?" He hesitates. "There are reports of Hellfire missile strikes from helicopters. The A-10 would leave different signatures." The general cuts him off sharply, jabbing a finger at a blurry reconnaissance photograph. "This is a tank kill. Look at the entry hole, small, clean. It's a kinetic strike, but not one of ours and nothing we've ever encountered." The room feels colder. The T-72 had been built to defeat the American M60, the British chieftain. It was engineered for a war of attrition, for mass formations and frontal breakthroughs. But the Americans hadn't deployed the M60. They had brought something entirely different, a weapon that hunted at night, that could not be detected, that could not be targeted, and that seemingly could not be stopped. The pride of Soviet industry, the greatest armored export of the USSR, was being turned into scrap metal on international television. And the men who built it, the generals in Moscow, could only watch their life's work crumble in real time. The impossible had become reality. The investigation had to begin immediately. This shocking display of a new form of warfare was a trauma not just for the Soviet military, but for every nation watching. A mystery demanded answers. The first horrifying question hung over the Moscow briefing room like a storm cloud. Was this an Iraqi failure or a Soviet failure? Were the export model tanks inferior? Or was the entire Soviet armored force, the one stationed in East Germany, the one expected to overrun NATO, nothing more than a hollow threat. The General Staff formed a special commission with one goal: collect battlefield wreckage, analyze satellite images, interrogate survivors, and find POWs who had seen this new American weapon up close. They needed to discover what killed the T-72. They needed to identify the Phantom. The smoke had barely settled over Kuwait when the hunt in Moscow began. The Special Commission assembled in a shielded conference room at the Ministry of Defense. Grim GRU officers, veteran tank designers from Ural Vagonzavod, and elderly marshals with decades of armored warfare behind them. Their mission was stark: determine what destroyed the T-72 and whether the T-80, the pride of Soviet armor, would fare any better. The first clues were the same images the entire world had watched. CNN's thermal footage was examined frame by frame. Technicians enlarged it, stabilized it, filtered it, and found nothing useful. The footage was spectacular propaganda, showing tanks erupting in bursts of white heat, but giving no insight into the weapon responsible. The resolution was too poor, the angles too distant. The real investigation fell to Soviet operatives still embedded in the collapsing Iraqi regime. This wasn't espionage, it was battlefield archaeology under fire. Posing as diplomats and ceasefire monitors, Soviet agents bribed, threatened, and bargained their way onto the still-smoking battlefields of Wadi al-Batin and the Highway of Death. They moved at night, avoiding unexploded ordnance and nervous American patrols. Their cameras weren't for television, they were for science. What they discovered froze their blood. They expected ruined T-72s. They did not expect a museum of Soviet failure. The tanks were hit, but the damage was all wrong. A seasoned Soviet armor officer, a man who knew tank wreckage from Afghanistan, expected the burned, cratered trauma of heat impacts. He expected charred holes and melted armor. Instead, he found something impossible. On the frontal glacis, the strongest point of the tank, where the crew believed they were invulnerable, were tiny, perfectly round entry holes. No burns, no blast marks, just a clean, fist-sized perforation. But inside the tank, the scene was apocalyptic. The crew compartment was a butchered tomb, shredded by a cone of superheated metal. The impact had turned the tank's own armor into shrapnel. In many cases, the projectile entered through the front, tore through the crew, and exited through the engine block. It had passed through 2 meters of steel, machinery, and ammunition, as if slicing through paper. Agents photographed everything. They extracted chunks of armor with diamond saws. They dug through the sand looking for the projectiles. What they found deepened the mystery further. Buried in craters and jammed inside engine blocks were long, needle-like metal darts, like oversized arrows with their fins torn away. They were not steel. They were not Soviet tungsten. They were a dark, heavy metal unlike anything that teams had seen. When the first samples reached the metallurgical labs at Kubinka, the spectrometers delivered a result that stunned everyone. Over 98% depleted uranium. Depleted uranium, the waste of nuclear enrichment, a material the Soviets knew intimately but avoided using. It ignited on impact. It was toxic. It was politically dangerous. And now it was being hurled at their tanks at unimaginable velocities. This wasn't a shell. It was an artificial meteor. The human intelligence reports were even worse. GRU case officers met shattered Iraqi tank commanders in dim back rooms in Damascus and Ordan. Their accounts were hysterical, contradictory, filled with raw terror that bordered on myth. One commander, a colonel, stared blankly at the wall, hands trembling. "We were in the best defensive position," he whispered. "We scanned with the TPN sight. We saw nothing, no lights, no heat, nothing. Then my wingman, he He just exploded. The turret shot straight into the air, the Iraqi colonel whispered. It spun. I saw it spin. The GRU handler scribbled in his notebook. Did you return fire? Return fire at what? At jinn? At ghosts? The colonel's voice cracked. We fired wherever we saw flashes. We emptied every shell we had. We hit nothing. All we heard on the radio was that sound, that awful sound. Not a diesel engine, not the rumble of a T-72. A hiss, a scream, like a jet engine sliding over the sand. They said the tanks hissed. A hissing tank? The GRU filed this account under battle shock. It defied logic. Then another survivor, a gunner dragged from a burning T-55, gave an even stranger report. My commander spotted one, he said shakily. He pointed. There, 3,000 meters. A dark shape. We fired. A 100-millimeter hit, a perfect hit. It didn't even slow down. It kept coming. It stopped. It fired. And the commander's cupola was just gone. I ran. Testimonies like these grew into a myth, a new American supertank prowling the desert, a boogeyman, a machine that slid silently across the dunes with a shrill turbine scream, invisible in darkness, immune to Soviet guns, and firing a mystical round that no armor could resist. Back in Moscow, the Special Commission tried desperately to separate fantasy from fact. Their desks were buried under clashing theories. Theory 1. The armor. This was the old guard's favorite. If Iraqi shells were bouncing off, then the Americans must have perfected composite armor. Soviet intelligence had long heard whispers of a British miracle material called chabum. They assumed it was a ceramic steel laminate. Now it was obvious the U.S. had mastered it and that Soviet heat and high-explosive rounds were now worthless. The Commission urged an emergency project to design vastly stronger shaped charge warheads. The Svinsets-1 and Svinsets-2 programs, designing new tungsten and uranium long rods, were pushed to top priority. Theory 2 was the gun. The younger engineers focused on the recovered depleted uranium penetrators. That, they argued, was the real breakthrough. If the enemy's projectile could punch through anything, then no amount of armor mattered. The problem was not Soviet defense. It was American offense. The USSR needed its own silver bullet. The call went out. Create longer, heavier, faster AP-FSDS rods. The Svinsets-1 and Svinsets-2 programs, designing new tungsten and uranium long rods, were pushed to top priority. Theory 3 was the sights. This was the theory no general wanted to confront. It came from a signals intelligence specialist who had spent his life studying Western electronics. He pointed to the reports that all said the same thing. We saw nothing. He gestured to CNN's thermal footage. Comrades, the Americans are not using infrared searchlights. They are not active systems at all. They are passive. They are seeing heat itself. The room chilled. The T-72's night sight, TPN-1, was an active IR system, essentially an invisible spotlight. To see anything, the tank had to shine a beam of infrared light. The specialist laid out the horrifying truth. Any American tank with passive thermals would see our T-72s shining like beacons from several kilometers away. We were blind. Worse, every time we tried to see, we announced our position. They were hunters wandering through a dark forest, holding a torch, stalked by something that saw heat. But the Commission, like many bureaucracies, chose the wrong conclusion. They could not accept that every theory was correct. They refused to believe the Americans had built not a better tank, but an entire integrated system, a gun that outranged them, sights that made them blind, armor that made them helpless, all fused together by a computer that let the Abrams fire with deadly precision at 40 miles per hour. The Soviet mindset, raised on mass assault and attrition warfare, searched for one simple cause: a better gun, a better armor plate, a better optic. They could not comprehend that the T-72 hadn't been defeated by a single technological breakthrough. It had been destroyed
by an entirely different philosophy. The boogeyman now had a name, passed around in intelligence reports pulled from American procurement documents. The M1, and they still had no idea what this machine truly was. While Moscow's commission chased metallurgical ghosts and argued about active versus passive optics, the real answer to their mystery was sitting in broad daylight at Fort Irwin, California, and on the training fields of West Germany. It wasn't a secret invention. It was a revolution born from a disaster, one that unfolded almost 20 years earlier. The story didn't begin in an American lab. It began on October 6, 1973, in the Sinai Desert. That day, during the Yom Kippur War, the entire concept of armored warfare caught fire. Israeli armored brigades, masters of blitzkrieg maneuver warfare, surged forward, only to be gutted by Egyptian infantry. These soldiers did not have new tanks. They carried small, man-portable Soviet M914 Malyutka anti-tank missiles, what NATO called the At-Sag-Sager. From more than 2 kilometers away, a conscript lying in a trench could guide a tiny wire-controlled missile into the side of a 50-ton Israeli M60 Patton. The tank, the unquestioned king of the battlefield, had suddenly become prey. For the U.S. Army, which expected to face a massive Soviet armored assault in Europe, this was an existential crisis. Their entire defense rested on the M60, a tank now proven vulnerable to a man with a shoulder weapon. The Pentagon's message was blunt. We are building the wrong tank. We are preparing for the wrong war. The struggling XR-185 program was resurrected under a new mandate, not to evolve the tank but to reinvent it from scratch. The result was a project centered on what engineers called the Big Five systems, and these 5 systems, combined, interlocked, and perfected, created the phantom now haunting Moscow. The first of the 5 was the armor. The challenge of the 1970s was the shaped charge warhead. Like the Siger missile, heat rounds did not need velocity. They used a focused jet of molten copper to punch through steel. Thickening steel solved nothing. It made tanks slower. It made them heavier, and it still didn't stop the molten jet. The solution had to be smarter. British researchers at the Chobham Laboratory had already devised a groundbreaking answer: composite armor. The Americans took the idea and perfected it under code name Burlington. It was not steel. It was a layered matrix: hardened steel plates, interleaved non-explosive reactive elements, and, crucially, dense ceramic blocks. When a heat jet hit the ceramic, the material fragmented, expanded, and dispersed the blast. When a kinetic dart struck it, the ceramic shattered the tip and deflected the rod. The new American tank, the M1, would be the first in the world armored with this technology.
It was, in every sense, a fortress mounted on tracks, immune to the very anti-tank weapons the Soviet Union had spent decades perfecting. This explained why Iraqi shells seemed to bounce off. They weren't deflecting, they were being vaporized. Second came the gun. America's previous tank gun, the 105mm M68, a proven British design carried over from the M60 Patton, was excellent. But the lessons from the Yom Kippur War were unmistakable. It could not consistently defeat a T-72 at long distances. The answer arrived from West Germany. Rheinmetall had built a monstrous 120mm smoothbore cannon. Without rifling, the gun could launch projectiles at extraordinary velocities. And those projectiles included the M829, the infamous silver bullet. This was the explanation for the tidy, surgical holes found in Iraqi armor. The M829 was a 10-pound depleted uranium penetrator housed in a discarding sabot. Fired at 1,670 meters per second, more than 3,700 miles per hour, it didn't explode.
It simply struck with such overwhelming kinetic energy that steel behaved like liquid. The M1 Abrams had been designed from day one to kill at extreme distance. It could destroy a T-72 at 3,000 meters, far beyond the T-72's own reliable firing envelope of roughly 2,000 meters. Third, and most devastating, was vision. The Soviet generals were right to be terrified. Their active infrared systems were not just inferior, they were liabilities. Projecting IR light into the night was like shining a giant invisible spotlight for any passive viewer to see. The M1 carried something entirely different, one of the world's first mass-fielded passive thermal imagers. This sight emitted nothing. It was a supercooled heat-detecting camera. On a cold desert night, a T-72 with a running engine, warm tracks, and a gun heated by firing blazed white-hot in the M1 gunner's view. Meanwhile, an Abrams could sit cold, engine off, completely silent. The Americans could see every tank, every soldier, every truck, through darkness, dust, smoke, even fog, from kilometers away. The Iraqis were blind. The Americans were omniscient, gods with heat vision. And the Abrams didn't have just one sight. It carried a hunter-killer system. The commander had his own independent thermal viewer. While the gunner was destroying one target, the commander was already scanning for the next. One button press slewed the turret instantly to the new target. The gunner fired. The cycle repeated. Find, slew, kill, find, slew, kill. This was how a single M1 could annihilate multiple T-72s under 60 seconds, creating the illusion of an entire battalion of invisible attackers. Fourth came the engine. That high-pitched hiss the Iraqi colonel described was not panic or imagination, it was real. The Abrams wasn't powered by a diesel. It was driven by a Honeywell AGT 1500, a 1,500 horsepower helicopter engine stuffed into a 60-ton chassis. It ran quieter than a diesel, had fewer moving parts, and could burn almost anything: diesel, gasoline, aviation fuel, even cheap tequila, as one American commander joked. Its true genius was acceleration, 0 to 20 miles per hour in 7 seconds. For a tank that weighed as much as a fully loaded semi-truck, this was terrifying agility. It allowed peekaboo tactics. The M1 could crest a ridge, fire a shot, then instantly reverse back behind cover before a T-72's slow turret could even swing around. Finally came the hidden core, the digital ballistic computer. This was the brain behind the Phantom. A Soviet gunner had to estimate range, calculate wind, and adjust manually. Essentially educated guesswork. An M1 gunner simply put the reticle on the target and pressed one button. The laser rangefinder measured distance with meter-level precision. Sensors measured crosswind. A tilt mechanism measured tank pitch. The computer factored all this, along with ammunition type, barometric pressure, and even microscopic barrel droop, and produced a perfect firing solution in milliseconds. It automatically moved the gun to the exact elevation needed. The gunner needed only to pull the trigger. This explained how the Abrams could fire accurately while barreling across rough desert terrain at 40 miles per hour. Its stabilization was so refined that the gun floated independently from the hull, as if suspended in air. A commander could drink coffee without spilling. The gunner could hold perfect aim. This was the Abrams Phantom, not merely a tank, but a system. A machine with armor that stopped Soviet rounds, a turbine that made it fast and unnervingly quiet, thermals that made it an apex hunter, and a computer-guided gun that turned it into a surgical executioner. While Soviet investigators treated the Gulf War as a crime scene, The Americans were polishing their weapon, fully aware that their adversary had no idea what was coming. The moment of revelation didn't occur on a battlefield, but on a rain-soaked testing ground in Meppen, Germany in 1990. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Cold War was effectively over. In a gesture that was either bold honesty or breathtaking confidence, the newly unified German government, alongside the U.S. Army, invited a group of high-ranking Soviet officers to witness a NATO firepower demonstration. The Moscow Commission arrived with grim faces and notebooks packed with grainy photos and chaotic reports from Iraq. They were here to finally confront the boogeyman. They stood atop a concrete viewing platform as fog drifted off the range. The Germans began with their Leopard 2A4. It was impressive, racing across mud while its long 120mm gun remained eerily steady, firing on the move and hitting targets at 2,500 meters. The Soviet generals nodded, respectable, comparable to their own T-80U. Then they heard the hiss. From the right side of the range, an M1 Abrams glided into view. It didn't roar, it screamed, the turbine's sharp whine cutting across the cold air. Then it accelerated. It didn't advance like a heavy machine, it lunged. The 63-ton tank surged forward, flinging mud from its tracks, hitting over 40 miles per hour almost instantly. "Watch target Delta," the American liaison announced over the loudspeaker. "Range, 3,000 meters." The Abrams didn't stop. It didn't slow. Its turret snapped sideways, independently of the hull. The gun fired, a brilliant flash and a crack rolling across the forest. 1 second later, the man-shaped tank target at 3 kilometers evaporated. Target Echo, 3,500 meters. The commander's independent thermal viewer had already identified the next target. The instant the main gun recoiled, the turret whipped to a new angle. The gunner's reticle locked onto another distant silhouette. Crack! Another strike, another kill. And still the Abrams had not slowed. The Soviet generals watching from the tower were speechless. Their binoculars trembled in their hands. Hitting a target at 3,500 meters while moving with a first-round kill? Their finest T-80 crews in a stationary firing position would be lucky to hit anything beyond 2,000 meters. This wasn't a tank. It was a long-range assassin on treads. But the Americans were only warming up. This wasn't a display. It was a demonstration of dominance. "Prepare for the static fire event," the liaison officer announced. At the 2,500-meter mark, a tow vehicle dragged something onto the range. The Soviet officers lowered their binoculars, squinting through the mist. Their breath caught. It was a T-72M, one of their own, captured from the Iraqi battlefield. Now positioned perfectly, its frontal glacis, the armor Soviet doctrine claimed was invincible, facing the Abrams. The M1A1 rolled to a halt. Its turbine idle dropped to that eerie, soft hiss. "Load M829A1," the American range controller announced through the loudspeaker. The Soviets stiffened. They knew that round. The silver bullet, the depleted uranium penetrator. This was the moment of truth. Everything Moscow's commission had theorized, denied, or feared was about to be proven, one way or another. The Abrams fired. There was no slow arc, no glowing shell, only the crack of the shot and an immediate impact. A thin, incandescent streak leapt from the Abrams to the T-72, a needle of superheated metal crossing the distance almost instantaneously. The Soviet generals stared, frozen, as the DU penetrator struck the frontal plate. They saw exactly what the battlefield photos from Iraq had shown, a tiny, precise entry hole, almost unimpressive. For half a second, nothing seemed to happen. Then the T-72 erupted. The tank didn't merely burn, it detonated. The turret, weighing nearly 18 tons, was ripped out of its mount and hurled over 50 feet into the air, spinning like a coin before crashing down with a dull, metallic thunder. A fountain of black, oily flame erupted from the hull as the ammunition carousel cooked off. It wasn't a tank anymore. It was a funeral pyre. The true shock for the Soviet delegation wasn't the sound of the explosion. It was the suffocating, absolute silence that followed. Because in that instant, everything they had refused to accept became undeniable. It wasn't Iraqi incompetence. It wasn't poor training. It wasn't the downgraded export model. It was this machine that could see them while they were blind, strike them long before they were in range, and shrug off their most powerful weapons as though they were stones thrown by children. The American liaison, with almost surgical politeness, leaned toward the senior Soviet marshal. "Our thermal package is quite effective, Marshal. We can detect and engage targets in any weather, day or night. We don't even need headlights." He didn't need to add the obvious. Every T-72 broadcast its position with an active infrared spotlight, a glowing beacon to any thermal viewer. The message was unmistakable. "We see you. You will never see us. The battle is over before you fire a single round." The Soviet delegation returned to Moscow in grim silence. The Special Commission dissolved. Its findings were no longer academic theories. They were a eulogy. A desperate, chaotic scramble began, the flailing of a nation realizing it was already falling. The first reaction was Contact 5. This became their great hope, a new generation of heavy explosive reactive armor, not like the light ERA used for countering missiles. Contact 5 consisted of dense steel boxes filled with explosives engineered specifically to defeat kinetic penetrators. When struck by an M829 round, the box would detonate sideways, snapping the dart in half before it could reach the tank's main armor. It was crude, brilliant, and unmistakably Soviet. They immediately bolted it onto the T-80U and the upgraded T-72B. The second reaction was the gun. The Svinets 1 and Svinets 2 programs were pushed to the highest level of national urgency. The USSR had to produce its own depleted uranium and tungsten long-rod penetrators. They needed a round that could match the reach and power of the M829.
They funneled resources into thermal imaging programs, secretly copying stolen French components in an effort to produce their own Agava and Buran systems. But it was hopeless. They were racing against time and losing. Contact 5 armor was brutally heavy, overloading the T-72's aging engine and already strained suspension. It was a bandage. Their new thermal sights were crude first-generation devices with pitiful resolution and a fraction of the M1's detection range. Another bandage. Their improved ammunition was promising, but without an advanced ballistic computer, it could never match the Abrams' accuracy. Yet another patch. The Soviets were trying to bolt slabs of metal and primitive electronics onto a doctrine frozen in 1972, while the Americans had evolved entirely beyond doctrine. The Abrams' true genius was never a single innovation. It was the synthesis. Armor, fire control, thermals, mobility, electronics, all fused into a seamless killing machine. The T-80U, weighed down by reactive boxes, slow to turn, clumsy in its ergonomics, had become a lumbering porcupine. The M1, in contrast, was a predator, fast, sharp, and frighteningly aware of its surroundings. The gap revealed in the Iraqi desert wasn't a gap, it was a canyon, and the Red Army stood on the wrong side of it. The final verdict didn't come from a secret GRU memorandum. It came from the pitiless arithmetic of the 100-hour ground war. When the ceasefire was declared and the haze lifted, the statistic that would haunt the Soviet Armored Academy was crystal clear: the kill ratio. During Operation Desert Storm,
M1 Abrams tanks identified, engaged, and destroyed over 1,800 Iraqi tanks, overwhelmingly Soviet T-72s, T-62s, and T-55s. Coalition aircraft and artillery destroyed thousands more. In exchange, the number of Abrams lost to enemy tank fire was 0. Not a single American tanker died at the hands of a T-72. A few Abrams were damaged, 9 were written off, nearly all due to landmines, friendly fire, or deliberate self-destruction to prevent capture. The phantom that Soviet analysts had chased was not simply lethal. For its crew, it was virtually untouchable. The T-72, the clenched steel fist of Soviet land power, had not just been beaten, it had been rendered irrelevant. A spear that could not pierce a shield and was wielded by warriors who could not see. This was more than a battlefield defeat. It was a structural collapse. The smoldering hulks strewn across Kuwait were the final burning chapter of the Soviet system itself. The T-72 was the crown jewel of the command economy, a tank meant to be good enough, built cheaply and in staggering numbers, a machine shaped by accumulation, not reinvention. The T-72 was little more than a refined T-64, which was an evolution of the T-62, which itself descended from the T-55. A lineage of marginal upgrades, a doctrine obsessed with being low, compact, and efficient, never visionary. Each new threat was met by welding another steel plate, bolting another ERA brick, or designing a slightly better sabot. It was a worldview built on reaction, not imagination. The M1 Abrams came from a different universe. It emerged from the shock of Yom Kippur, born not as an update to the M60, but as a clean-sheet redefinition of what a tank could be. A fusion of a turbine power plant, composite armor, thermal vision, and a digital fire control brain, integrated into a single coherent ecosystem. A machine so costly and complex that only a hyper-competitive, innovation-driven capitalist economy could bring it into existence and refine it for more than a decade. By comparison, the Soviet Union in its dying years simply had no fuel left for such a leap. Contact 5 armor and the Sivanets penetrator programs were the frantic death spasms of a superpower in freefall. They were trying to retrofit a 1960s-era vehicle to fight a ghost from the 21st century. And the economic cost of this asymmetrical arms race, a race lost before it began, helped push the Soviet system past the breaking point. The M1 Abrams didn't just bankrupt the T-72, it helped bankrupt the country that designed it. 10 months after the Highway of Death, in December 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The riddle that had begun on a flickering CNN broadcast had never really been about a tank. The T-72 wasn't defeated by uranium darts or thermal imaging alone. It was defeated by an entire worldview, military, industrial, political, that could not adapt to a future it failed to imagine. The phantom that roamed the Kuwaiti desert wasn't a super tank. It was the embodiment of what came next. And in that future, the Soviet Union no longer existed. The true image that marks the Cold War's end isn't just the fall of the Berlin Wall. It is a T-72 turret silhouetted against a desert night, flung skyward, spinning helplessly as it is torn from its hull by an invisible, unstoppable, and undeniable force.